Welcome to the Catacomic Machine podcast. My name is Matt, and I'm really excited about this episode, in which you'll hear a new voice. Jake Given is a PhD student at Villanova, and he and I had a chance to speak recently with MaryJane Rubenstein, professor of religion at Wesleyan University in Connecticut. I thoroughly enjoyed this conversation, and after you check out the episode, go over to Amazon and pre-order her forthcoming book, Pantheology's Gods, Worlds, Monsters. That should be released, I believe, in September, and I'll link to that in the show notes, along with a few other things. All right, anyway, here is MaryJane Rubenstein.
MaryJane Rubenstein, and I am currently teaching at Wesleyan University in Connecticut. My position there is technically in modern Christian thought, and I cover basically the period from Augustine through, yesterday. Long schlep. My training is really in continental philosophy, which tends to intersect in various sort of tortuous ways with Christian and Jewish philosophy in particular. And recently I've been writing more on the intersections of science and religion, often vexed intersections of science and religion, particularly those pertaining to cosmology and the history of cosmology and the philosophy of cosmology.
Yeah, cool. And you grew up in New Jersey, right? I
did grow up in New Jersey.
Yeah, Jersey girl.
Right?
Whereabouts?
No one must always stand up for Jersey. I grew up in a town called Middletown, New Jersey, which is just north of Asbury Park, of Bruce Springsteen fame,
yep.
And just kind of next to Homedale, New Jersey, where the cosmic microwave background was discovered, interestingly enough.
Yeah, that's cool. That's where I'm from. I'm in Bloomfield, which is like more North Jersey.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah. Have you been to Asbury Park in recent years?
Recent. I was last there probably 6 or 7 years ago.
Okay. Yeah. There's been a lot of development. I have family down there, and
there's the Long Branch. I know that they've done that like big boardwalk on Long Branch, and
yeah. There's a lot of gentrification and stuff.
I know like they took down what is that clown's name in Asbury Park? Sully Tully.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's one of those. It's kind of a mixed bag, but yeah. In one of the essays that you sent me, I think it's from the Entangled Worlds one, which is the collection of essays on religion and new materialism that you co-edited with Catherine Keller. You gave this vignette of an 11-year-old MaryJane crossing the 4-lane highway. And in the story that you tell, you were holding a baby goat named Mondo, which is a great name for a baby goat, for one of these like living nativity scenes that happened during Christmas. I was curious, is that like a tradition that you guys did? Did you do that every year?
Yeah, so for a while we were what my brother calls denominationally promiscuous. We started out on my mom's side. My dad's side's Jewish. My mom's side's Roman Catholic. They were, and but there were a bunch of divorces, so we couldn't really stay Catholic. So we became Lutheran for a while. Then they became Presbyterian, and then Episcopalian. Like kind of just hopping around. But while I was in middle school, we were Lutheran, and they had this annual live nativity, and so we kids would each be assigned some role in the live nativity. Most of the girls wanted to be Mary, but she just sort of sat there. I really liked being Herod because Herod got to be really parade back and forth looking vexed. So I'd usually sort of hope they'd give me Herod. But that 1 year they turned out that the pastor's wife met somebody in a local, I think 7-Eleven, who just happened to have these farm creatures living with her in her little suburban plot of 2/3 of an acre. And she lent them to us for that live nativity.
Yeah, that's cool. Are you still involved in the church scene? Like, I'm sort of curious about your religious inclinations. I mean, I know your work is in Christianity, but like how that symbol zone has been formative for you.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I like to say that the church I don't go to is an Episcopal church, the one I never managed quite to get to. It's probably the place I feel most at home, but I'm rarely there. I don't know. We sort of do everything in my family. We do Jewish holidays, we do Christian holidays. I practice yoga.
Okay.
Kind of feel like I'm a pagan.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of throw everything at it. I feel sort of religiously cataphatic, like just kind of throw all of it at it.
Yeah, just throw it all in.
Yeah, exactly.
Very promiscuous, as you said.
Right.
Yeah. And now you're in the Boston area, as you mentioned. I was there last November for AAR, and I think I mentioned this to you in one of my emails, that I was just sitting a couple seats down from you when you gave your short talk at the New Materialism seminar. Which I was a little bit surprised by the size of that crowd. I didn't realize so many were interested in that
Yeah.
sort of thing. But maybe we can talk a little bit about new materialism in your work. But not to embarrass you, but like, did you notice that you were the only one who got applause during that whole thing?
No, did that happen?
Yeah, it was cool. It was cool. But it's like, I think that, the scholarship aside, I think there's an excitement and joy for the work that comes through when you speak. It's sort of it's intoxicating. And I remember actually my introduction to your work was by way of a random YouTube video. You're talking about Heidegger and being an ontotheology, and it was weird because it was like this hour-long talk, and like I couldn't stop smiling. I don't think anyone has ever made Heidegger that much fun, honestly.
Thank you so much. That's right.
So I'll link to that in the show notes. But I watched a few more videos, and then I bought this book, Strange Wonder.
Yeah.
And is this your first book?
It is. Yeah.
Yeah. And we don't have to dig into it too deeply, but the subtitle is like The Closure of Metaphysics and the Opening of All. Mm-hmm. And I think if people were to kind of read that subtitle and that's all they knew about your work, they might get the wrong idea. I mean, maybe I could be getting that wrong, and you can tell me if I am, but like, I don't know, how post-metaphysical do you consider yourself to be, if at all?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I should say at first, two things. First of all, that I don't renounce anything I wrote in that book, but I would have written it differently if I wrote it now, if I were to write it now. How post-metaphysical do I consider myself? I don't think it's possible to be post-metaphysical. I should probably say that pretty straightforwardly. And I don't know that even Heidegger, say, under whose spell that book is really exists. I don't think even Heidegger ever thought that it would be possible fully to exit metaphysics. I think he hoped that there would be some kind of new beginning for thought. But that new beginning would still always have to somehow take its departure from metaphysics insofar as we speak according to certain grammatical rules that are structured metaphysically. So that's just sort of strictly speaking. But more narrowly, what he meant, and the part of it that I meant to take more seriously, was the metaphysical tradition as an unself-conscious, unreflective pursuit of some kind of singular truth, extra cosmic, unchanging truth. And now I'm sort of weaving Nietzsche into my Heidegger here a little bit. Metaphysics understood as pursuing a progressive path toward certainty and truth and mastery of the world, of the universe, both noetic mastery and certainly physical and political mastery. And that tradition can be called the metaphysical tradition in a kind of narrow sense. And so that we don't have to ask so much about whether it's possible to think unmetaphysically or, post-metaphysically, we can just ask, is it possible to think in a different way from that will toward dominion, that all-conquering impulse of what Heidegger at least called the metaphysical tradition. So I think I would have given, to answer your question, I would have given the book a different subtitle to avoid that kind of confusion. But I do still stand by that that attempt to think in the wake of the untrammeled pursuit of certainty and dominion in thinking.
Yeah, Jake, you were saying the other day, you were saying something about even Caputo, right, who's maybe one of the most staunch post-metaphysical thinkers, has kind of like made a turn on that. Yeah.
Well, he's gotten softer about his prohibition on metaphysics, from what I can tell. I think he is very much in line with what MaryJane is saying here, that like what he means by metaphysics is basically this Thomistic kind of or neo-Thomistic kind of way of thinking. But I think he's hung out with enough process people for long enough to realize that it's a fun scene, I guess. If that makes sense.
Okay.
And I think that within different discursive regimes, certain terms take on resonance and significance.
Exactly.
Later on, right? And metaphysics used to be a thing that designated a particular regime of thought that everybody in the wake of Heidegger and sort of in the trail of Derrida was trying to circumvent or somehow leap over or something like that. But insofar as there are other schools of thought, like, as you're saying, Jake, like process theology, that claims metaphysics, but means something different by it.
Exactly.
At some point, you get to a point where you're like, who cares? Like, right?
Yeah.
The words don't matter all that much to me. What matters more is what we're trying to signify by these words. And if what you mean by metaphysics is what I mean by post-metaphysics, great, let's do metaphysics.
Right. Let's go from there.
Yeah.
Actually, at the end, somewhere near the end of your book on cosmology, the multiverse book, you touch on the relationship between physics and metaphysics.
Yeah.
And I know, like we've already said, metaphysics has been sort of a dirty word. Perhaps it's being rehabilitated. And I'm thinking about the relationship between physics and metaphysics. Like, what's been helpful for you in thinking about that?
Right. I can see where this nexus of questions is coming from. It's a really good one. Right. When I talk about the relationship between physics and metaphysics, I'm talking about metaphysics in a very, very broad sense, to designate not just philosophical reflections on what's beyond the physical, right, etymologically metaphysics, but philosophical assumptions about the nature of what is. And those, very broadly speaking, metaphysical assumptions, I think, structure any kind of inquiry at all, including physical inquiry. That having been said, physics, to name one of the natural sciences, can get along pretty well without reflecting upon the metaphysical conditions of its possibility, right? For almost all that it tries to do, or that it endeavors to do, right? To get us cell phones, to make sure that airplanes take off and land, right? It doesn't need to reflect on its metaphysical structures and conditions of possibility. But when physics edges into the very small and the very large, which is to say the quantum on the one hand and the cosmological on the other hand, at those 2 points, it seems to collide with metaphysics, not because metaphysics lies at the edge of physics, because metaphysics structures physics everywhere, but it only becomes a problem in the cases of the very small and the very large. So I think that's what I was trying to get at there.
Yeah, this question of the relationship between physics and metaphysics, I heard this story like literally just a few days ago. I thought it was really interesting. You've probably heard this before, but I think it would surprise some people, because it surprised me to learn that Descartes, who sometimes is credited with getting the whole scientific enterprise moving along with the discourse on method and stuff, he was visited in a dream by an angel who told him that the conquest of nature was to be achieved through number and measurement.
Mm.
I don't know how historical that is, or if it's just like legend. I haven't had time to look into it, but when I heard that, it sort of foregrounded for me what's this provocative question, like, to what extent is science able to even get off the ground without something we might call revelation?
Yeah, right.
And I think it's related to this question of physics and metaphysics, the question of theology and science.
Yeah, it's a gorgeously, I'm so glad you read that the way you did, right? It's a gorgeously self-sabotaging prophecy that the conquest of the universe will take place through number and measurement, but this is revealed in a dream by an angel. Yeah. And that's that funky place that Descartes occupies at the dawn of what we now call modernity. His whole, if you read his meditations, right, the meditations is structured both at the beginning and the end by the evil deceiver on the one hand and God on the other hand, right? So that the entire, what becomes known as the scientific method, or the to speak more Cartesianly, the method of proceeding by means of clear and distinct ideas, relies, he says at the very end of the meditations, right? It's at the end of meditation 5, right? He says that lasting knowledge in the sciences depends exclusively on the knowledge of the one true God. Because if we don't know that God is, and also that God is what God is, which is to say infinite and perfect, therefore not a deceiver. We can't have any knowledge of either sense perception or reason, what dictates of reason on the other hand. So the whole scientific enterprise rests on this theological assumption. Now, of course, like the minute you've got the theological assumption in place, it's so minimal that the minute you've got it in place, you can forget about it.
Right.
And you can go and do the work of the sciences. But right, I think that what's so exciting to me and sort of funny to me about the way that quantum physics and cosmology operate these days is that they keep unwittingly colliding against this sort of theological bogeyman that was more clearly there in the writings of somebody like Descartes, somebody like Boyle in the early modern period, and whom we've forgotten about because he was such a sort of minimalist and kind of uninteresting God to begin with, right? The one who just assures you that you can trust your senses, or the one who just gets the world going, or the one, right? So fair enough that modern science forgets about it, but modern science depends on it at the same time.
Yeah, that God is already sort of a deus ex machina, right?
Yeah.
And that makes me think you have this essay in the forthcoming Handbook of Radical Theology that Chris and Jordan and I guess others have been working on for a while. I think it's available now.
It is almost available.
Almost available.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, in that, do you suggest deploying radical theology as a method to identify and kind of kill the gods, for lack of a better way to say that lurk in modern science? And I was wondering if you wouldn't mind unpacking the case you're making there, because I think it's relevant to what we're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I think the case I'm making, so the essay is, at least the charge of the essay was just to reflect on the relationship of radical theology and the natural sciences. And there's not a ton of work on radical theology and the natural sciences. Some people do it. Clayton Crockett and Jeff Robbins do. Mark Taylor, in some ways, gets at some of it. But the question that I chose to answer, I think, was how it is that radical theology might help the cause of what we might broadly call science studies, right? Like, how do we approach the project of understanding what's going on in the natural sciences, how they operate, what it is they're telling us, and how. And one way in which radical theology, I think, can be helpful and fun and interesting is to sort of sniff out these theological longings and remnants in many of the natural sciences. In, for example, the neuroscientific effort to find the, minimal unit of consciousness that can stay. Or in the modern physical effort to find a grand unified theory. The cosmologist Marcelo Gleiser calls this science as being under the mythical spell of the one. He says this is monotheistic science, like the notion that there has to be one way to understand the universe that unifies general relativity and quantum theory. Like maybe there isn't. Maybe there are actually 18. But the conviction that there has to be one, he says, is a theological conviction. So I think that radical theology, in its attunement to the numerous resurrections of the old God of power and might, the old Father God, is fairly well positioned to study the natural sciences in such a way that they see where this theological longing for unity and power and dominion shows up even in the purportedly non-theistic natural sciences. And so that's the sort of critical movement. So that on the one hand. Yep. And on the other hand, to see where more interesting, say, theologies might be emerging in the natural sciences, where they might be allowing us to think differently about processes of creation and transformation and destruction, right? The functions that we have traditionally ascribed to divinity. If we could stop looking for just a hot second at this old dude god, we might see more interesting configurations and operations of non-anthropomorphic divinity at work in the natural sciences, again, even where they don't know that they're setting them forth.
So this is something that struck me in the science essay, and I was wondering if you could reflect a little more on it. You sometimes talk about sort of like almost actively killing God as being like the sort of project of radical theology. And other times you sort of seem to, well, and it's not just you, this is in radical theology in general, it seems to be more like just recognizing that God is already dead. I'm wondering what you sort of envision as like the goal or the method of radical theology. Like, are we murderers or are we undertakers? You know what I mean?
Right. You know, I think I've changed my views on this. I think when I was just reading, well, I trained as an undergraduate in part under Mark Taylor, so I've sort of always been under the thrall of a kind of radical theology. But I think early on, I thought the task was to recognize that we're beating a dead horse. God is already dead. These are the places that it's become clear that God is dead, right? So the task of radical theology is to track genealogically the death of this God or something like that. And I think I thought initially in those days that somebody like William Hamilton, who was like, go kill God, kill him, right? Actively seek him out and destroy him, seemed on the one hand sort of needlessly violent, and on the other hand just like too angry somehow, or too or sort of somehow unreconstructed and not subtle enough.
It's too Oedipal.
Right. Exactly, right, and like actively Oedipal. But I think I'm sorry about all these things that are clicking. Right. So actively Oedipal. But I think that it's been my more recent involvement with science studies that's caused me to realize that it doesn't make a ton of sense to say that, God is dead if God as a transcendent patriarch keeps operating, right? If God is a transcendent operator, he keeps operating not only in, the Texas textbooks that end up getting reproduced for the whole country so that kids in public schools don't get to learn evolution without also learning the so-called other side of the evolution debate, right? not just in that way, not just in the evangelical endorsement of the current presidency that has resulted, among other things, in the conviction that if there really is an environmental crisis, this sovereign God is going to take care of it. I mean, those are terrifying ways in which that God, Nietzsche notwithstanding, the Shoah notwithstanding, is most definitely alive, but also in the natural sciences that are so angry with the political deployment of this hyper masculine super dude against the sciences, that they spend all of this effort and energy saying, haha, there's no God, there's no such thing as God, we hate you, God, you're so annoying, God. Even in those vigorous and increasingly ridiculous proclamations of the death of that God continues to operate because he keeps motivating these, for the most part, white male scientists to say, aha, we have finally killed him off. So in that sense, I think it is important to do the more active work of saying, like, this is that same dude, right? Like, God, he's still working. Not just in the case of people who proclaim his force and existence and power, and either benevolence or hatred of gays or whatever, but also in the force of the secular sciences that seem to be thinking they're doing something when they say that they've got another explanation for the way things go, because as it turns out, the other explanation for the way things go tends to reduplicate that same logic of sovereignty and masculinity that it thinks that it's killing off by just saying that there's no dad dude behind it.
Right.
Yeah, I think that there is more of an imperative, and I deploy Hamilton here with a kind of it's sort of fun. It's the kind of irony to say, like, all right, let's kill about, right? I don't really mean it. I just mean more that there needs to be more of an active attention and attentiveness to the more subtle places that the logic of singularity and dominion and mastery is emerging.
Yeah.
That's really helpful.
Yeah. And in that, the radical theology piece, right? You make a pretty strong statement in there. What'd I do with it? You write, I would like to suggest that radical theology ought to maintain this double movement of Bonhoeffer's, to kill off the metaphysical God wherever he continues to raise his kingly head. This is what pretty much just what you just said. And to seek those traits we associate with divinity, creativity, sustenance, renewal, and transformation in the manifold self-subsisting processes of this natural world. Obviously, that second move is just as important as the first, and what you are proposing there of basically seeking divinity in immanence, is that pantheism that you're talking about, or not really?
It is what I'd like to call pantheism. It is not what everybody would call pantheism. I think there are a lot of ways of finding divinity in immanence. And the word, immanence has been en vogue theologically for a while at this point. And certainly process theologians are going to talk about the immanence of divinity. Even, open relational theologians talk about the immanence of divinity. Incarnational theologians, Episcopalians and Catholics talk about it.
But I know your current work is on pantheism, so I'm sure people have at least heard the term, have maybe a vague sense
right
of what it's all about. But what is it? Where does it come from, and what's it all about?
Yeah. So here's where I'll talk a bit about where the project came from, and hopefully that'll allow me to talk about what the hell pantheism is. It was occurring to me in my studies of cosmology, quantum physics, and my beginning investigations into nonlinear biologies and thermodynamics, that increasingly the natural sciences that think that they're totally non-theistic or atheistic or just unrelated entirely to the theological project, are producing these sort of beautiful and subtle immanentist theologies by describing these old theological processes of, again, creation and sustenance and transformation and destruction as entirely internal to the natural world itself. And these like complex, manifold, relational processes are differ from field to field. And they're gorgeous. And I think it would be interesting to attend to each of them as its own set of mythico-theological narratives and accounts. So and that I think is a more interesting way to deal with the relationship between religion and science than to ask, whether or not we can still affirm the existence of some dad dude in the sky. So it began to occur to me that the natural sciences, at their most interesting, are not atheistic; they're pantheistic. They're different models of pantheism. Pantheism being very straightforwardly, the identification of God and world. To be a pantheist is to say that what we mean by God is nothing other than and nothing less than what we mean by the natural world. So I thought that what I was going to do in this project, this pantheism project, was just to make a little, map, like an intellectual history and kind of genealogy of some of the current natural sciences in their sort of different flavors of pantheism. But when I went to do this, what I realized was that pantheism is just a really messed up term historically. Like, it doesn't really have a history other than the history of being a term of unconditional derision. It's a term that scholars levy against one another whenever they mean to say this position is stupid. So this was the issue that I found. The issue that I found was that pantheism, again, is a term of derision and name calling more than anything else. So what I've tried to do in this pantheism project is just to figure out what pantheism would be if we were to take it seriously. And what I'd like to suggest it would be is, again, just a very straightforward identification of divinity with the processes of the natural world. But then the project for anybody who wants to think pantheistically is to figure out what the natural world is and what we mean by natural world. And what then from there it would look like to identify divinity with it.
Yeah, and that identification of God and world has a lot of implications for politics, ethics, and how we think about gender and stuff like this, right? It's all encoded within these narratives and these symbol sets. But one of the things that you write about, maybe related to that, is the way that pantheism disrupts the whole symbolic edifice of the West. Can you say more about that and why that is?
Yeah, I hope that pantheism disrupts the whole symbolic edifice of the West, right? We keep looking for the hinge that might unhinge the whole system. But if we can say that the kind of narrow metaphysics we've been talking about, right, the narrow metaphysical tradition of power and might and cognitive dominion, that it's structured on a series, of course, of hierarchical oppositions between spirit and body, between mind and matter, between male and female, between light and darkness. These ontological and gendered and racialized privileges all get mapped onto one another fairly cleanly, so that the masculine, light-filled, rational side is consistently privileged over the emotional, bodily, feminine, dark side. If that's just a sort of given in terms of the structuring history of Western metaphysics, you can find it in Aristotle's Metaphysics. He attributes it to Pythagoras. If that's the case, the argument can be made, and the argument has been made by Grace Jansen, a feminist philosopher of religion, that whole metaphysical structure is held in place by the hierarchical distinction between God and world. world, that God is associated with everything rational, disembodied, light-filled, and good, and world is associated with everything feminine, irrational, bodily, and bad. So if the hypothesis is, if we were, as Jansen says, to take for granted that what divinity means is bodily, plural, multiple, and in that sense, feminine, but that's different from saying God is female or something like that. But that divinity embodies those traits and enacts those traits that we tend to associate with femininity. Then the whole structure, her hypothesis is, the whole structure of metaphysics then collapses because we don't have the linchpin distinction, which is to say the distinction between God and world.
So as I was reading your piece on monstrosity, which I found really fascinating, something I was struck by was, as you've noted here, that pantheism is primarily emerges as a term of derision. But also you talk about other affects associated with pantheism, like especially horror, right? As if in sort of looking at a pantheistic system, we're confronted with a monstrosity. Opposites are sort of fused that ought not be, right? In this kind of, from the point of view of sort of the metaphysical tradition.
Right.
And I couldn't help but like think about Freud and think about civilization and its discontents, that first chapter on the oceanic feeling too, right? Because there's this other affect that's also kind of associated with pantheism, the oceanic feeling, and thinking about how in psychoanalysis, like both horror and this sort of mystical union are associated with the maternal, or this return to the womb in a way.
Yeah.
And it's so strange and interesting to me. I guess what I'm trying to get at is what's sort of for you the links between pantheism as a metaphysical system or as a speculative or philosophical system, and the sort of different affects and attunements, the different ways that, say, horror or like certain forms of mysticism, or even the configuration of the ego, sort of all play off of each other. Does that make any sense? I feel like I'm rambling, but
no, it makes a ton of sense. Yeah, it's an oceanic question, and it's crucial.
Right.
So I think for me, affect plays both a kind of critical diagnostic role in this project, and ultimately probably a constructive role, but I don't quite get there. And that connection would be the one that would connect this pantheism project to the earlier Wonder project, if I were smart enough to be able to make those connections. But so the trail that I'm trying to follow in terms of the West's revulsion toward or against pantheism is precisely this trail of horror and disgust. One sees, as you've been saying, Jake, one sees with shocking regularity this visceral language deployed against anything that seems like pantheism in Western philosophy and theology. People call it, as you've been saying, monstrous, horrible, vile, execrable. And then at the same time, if you keep reading these, particularly 19th century sources, they will start to say, but it's also alluring, seductive, and attractive, just like, of course, the womb, right? This revolting, disgusting place that also has a kind of nostalgic fascination and inspires a sort of longing and adoration and need that then, of course, ends up fueling the horror and the hatred. So part of my just like methodological process has been to follow that trail of revulsion and seduction through really a few centuries of sort of fear and loathing of pantheism. And I think you're exactly right to say that the kind of repellent seductiveness that one finds in treatments of what is often called pantheism, is highly gendered. It's just the stuff that that psychoanalysts will attribute to the relationship to the female body, particularly the maternal body. So it's monstrous enough just by virtue of its being maternal, but then to be identified with, for that whole maternal mess, to be identified with divinity is sort of even more monstrous. Pierre Bayle calls it the most monstrous hypothesis that could be imagined, because it's not just that you've got the revolting feminine, but you've got the revolting feminine conflated with the traditionally masculine male form of divinity, which of course was arguably, if we want to think along with Mary Daly, right, divinity is arguably said to be insisted upon. It is insisted that divinity is male, arguably because of a kind of hatred of the female power of birth, right? That the argument becomes something like, okay, fine, every birth in the universe comes out of female bodies, but the birth of the universe came out of a male head, or like, right, a male disembodied. So haha, right? It's like this game of one-upsmanship. And to undo that move, that one-upsmanship, by saying, you know what, I think that creation all the way down might be a bodily and relational, and to that extent feminine, which again is not saying God is female, right? To that extent feminine process sort of just undoes the whole game. This inspires all sorts of monstrosity. I think it's interesting in Freud that the minute he mentions the oceanic feeling, which is his best, the best description he can find for the sort of religious affect. The moment he mentions it, he says, by the way, I don't have it.
Yeah, exactly.
I can't get it. Yeah. I don't really know what these people are talking about. They're crazy. Precisely because Freud is engaged here in what he identifies as a scientific project.
Right.
Can't be involved with science and have the oceanic feeling. And yet it is usually something like the oceanic feeling that prompts people to spend all that damn time making themselves into scientists in the first place. So again, with this kind of attraction and revulsion, we see a lot of this. The ocean kind of comes up over and over again. There are these threads all over Melville's Moby Dick. And Melville himself was said in a letter to Nathaniel Hawthorne. He told Hawthorne, "Look, I hate like pantheist seduction so much, but I also can't distance myself from them. I am so drawn to it, and I hate it at the same time." Insofar as a kind of maternalized, incarnate, bodily, and like irreducibly bodily divinity seems to inspire this sort of affect of the sublime, right? This horror and amazement, this like terror and seduction. Insofar as it seems to do it anyway, it seems like there are sort of two options. You can either decry it and run from it and make fun of it and mock it and swear you're not at all interested. Or you can see what it means to kind of try to abide that revolted fascination and see what comes of it. And at least that's what I'm trying, at least strategically, at least, experimentally to do here.
Well, and so if I can just ask one more or follow up in this sort of Freudian line of questioning, what I find so fascinating, and I thought it was hilarious that you mentioned that Freud sort of like has to protect himself or hedge himself in by saying, by the way, I don't experience this sort of feeling or whatever. He, throughout all of his writings, he has to identify not just religious feelings and sentiments and affects, but also the structure of religion as such with prohibition, right? Which in the Oedipal kind of configuration is symbolized by the Father. And so what seems to be at stake, maybe, I don't know, I'd have to spend a lot of time thinking about how to argue it, but what seems to be at stake is that if Freud is willing to admit of a pre-Oedipal origin of religion, then his entire theory of religion, which is identified with the Father, the masculine, the prohibition, falls apart. So what's interesting to me, and I guess my question to you is, how does religion as an sort of institutional practice, as a communal practice, and as a sort of disposition to the world, how does that change when we start to engage some of these other ways of thinking, when we start to sort of open up to the possibility that the divine might be located in a less paternal, less prohibitive kind of imaginary? Does that make sense?
Yes, it's super, 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 super smart. Right. Okay. So, yes, when we move, as Daly would say, beyond God the Father, we move sort of back behind God the Father. And if we're still thinking in terms of the Oedipal regime, back behind prohibition to something like engendering, right? Like allowing to happen. And then Freud would have to get back behind even his own origins of it. But this is constantly what Freud is doing, right? Sort of allowing us to read him against himself to get it a more interesting experience.
Exactly.
Like nobody buys that thing about the Jews murdering Moses, right? That's just not, it's the least interesting thing that Freud ever says is the shit he says. But so we can sort of mobilize Freud to get back behind Freud. And then we become, I don't know, Schleiermacher or something like that, right? Who was insisting in the mid-19th century that religion has been mistaken for a system of metaphysics on the one hand and morals on the other hand. So that it tells what is and what to do, whereas what religion for Schleiermacher genuinely would be an affective structure. It would be a deliberate cultivation of the capacity to be astonished. Right. So, what this would mean in terms of communal practice, I'm in the middle of reading Richard Powers' Overstory. I don't know if you've been tuned into this book at all. It's absolutely stunning. It's one of these late Pomo novels that takes you into the worlds of a million different characters and then relates them all, and they all become sort of branches of one another. And their connection is all through trees and through the wisdom of trees and the violence enacted against trees. And there are these scenes of disparate people meeting one another under the most bizarre circumstances by virtue of an inexplicable drive to stand up for and with trees. And I know that trees tend to be a fairly overused trope of kind of earth religion. So forgive me here, but it's a beautiful.
They're so awesome though.
They're so awesome. And it turns out they talk to one another. And it turns out they're, trees are not just themselves, right? They're symbiotic with fungi and air and just everything in earth and soil. Right. And these intersections cause, some of them to try to live in trees to prevent, in old redwoods, to try to prevent them from being logged, or to, put their bodies on the line, to stand in front of bulldozers and things like that. These are communal, ritual, collective practices that certainly don't tell us, how to make the Methodist Church a groovier place. I don't know how to get from there to there. But they do allow us to see religion showing up in the contemporary world in ways that that seem to me more vibrant than the question of how to make the Methodist Church a groovier place.
Well, and what I like about it too is that you're able to sort of account for some kind of imperative or some kind of moral attunement without it being sort of based on prohibition or sort of law giving or something like that. That there's some more sort of fundamental loyalty to the whole, or however you want to talk about it, to the
that attunement is not characterized by negativity,
exactly,
but by affinity.
Exactly.
Right. In this case, I think it's similar to the kind of affective cultivation that Bill Connolly has been calling for throughout his recent works, right? I think that a broadly speaking pantheist attunement to the world prevents from the outset the move that takes the world as a given and then asks like, okay, what else, right?
Yeah.
The world is a given. Yeah. Now, what are we supposed to do on top of it, or to get past it, or like, now what else, right? I think the what else is an absurd question. Like, well, what about the more? It's like, well, the more is right here. The more is built within the structure of what is. Also, like, do you know what is so well that you can ask what the more is?
Yeah, that's awesome.
So there's a nihilism, I think, built into that. There we are, right? Narrowly construed metaphysic that tries to get beyond this world and think about what else is there. Because it begins by saying, all right, this world isn't enough, or this world is just like Play-Doh and we have to do something with it, or this, right? If it turns out that our most difficult imperative is simply to allow what is to be, right? Like, and I don't mean to sound so Heideggerian.
Yeah.
Like, just like figuring out a way for trees to exist in this particular moment is going to be almost impossible, like next to impossible. And not just trees understood as like farmed commodities, but trees as trees are supposed to be existing in relation to moss and lichens and forests, right? And like the decay of the forest and the death of the forest and the birds that those trees allow to live with it, right? Like trees, broadly speaking, as these polysymbiotic living beings, it would take every resource that all of us have just to figure out how to enable that to be in the first place. So the thing that I find so compelling about Pan is that he's a trickster. He shows up to help, right? But also just to play and to make fun of people and to scare them and to shock them and he's not all good and he's not all evil and he's certainly not all goat and he's not all God and he's not all human and he's like a little bit of all of these things. He's a good, straightforward, and
he plays a mean flute.
And he plays a mean flute, which is a sort of hilarious instrument to begin with, right? Like, the thing that's so annoying about the whole tradition of seeing Pan as a forerunner of Christ is just that it misses the joke, right? It misses certainly the specific joke, which is too detailed to go into, about the lament of Pan being dead. But it also misses the playfulness of divinity, right? By then sobering us into a singular reflection of the death of a certain man in occupied Palestine. And the locus of divinity moves from playfulness to sorrow, from life to death, from the whole natural world to one dude on a cross, which isn't, incidentally, the way that many of the most interesting Christian theological traditions read their own tradition. I should say this, right? So in addition to being a life-denying theology, this effort to sort of subsume Pan by a particular univocal understanding of Christ is like loses the playfulness and the joy of the world.
I wanted to ask you about a guy who I think is really central to your work, Giordano Bruno. Before hearing you talk about him in Boston, the only thing I really knew about him was that he had an influence to some degree on Spinoza, and I'm actually curious about that connection to Spinoza, and maybe we can say something about it. But I think it might be helpful if you wouldn't mind giving us a quick introduction to Bruno. Who is this guy? What was he all about? And how does he figure into what you're doing?
Right. So Giordano Bruno is best known for having been executed at the hands of the Inquisition in the year 1600 in the middle of Rome. He was burned at the stake on an Ash Wednesday because, that's cute. And he was... The reason for his execution tends to be flattened into something like he contested the authority of the church, or he was a Copernican and the church was Ptolemaic or something like that. And so Bruno becomes best known today as a kind of secular martyr for secular science. But of course, the term martyr still gets retained, which is hilarious. So, once again, these theological tropes get retained in these triumphalist stories about the overcoming of theology. So Bruno gets killed by the Inquisition, but what he really gets killed for, it's hard to find any sort of straightforward account of it. But the repeated accusation is that he denied the divinity of Christ. The thing that's fascinating is he didn't really deny the divinity of Christ so much as he denied the singularity of Christ.
Right.
Bruno had this fascinating cosmology according to which the universe itself is the unfolded being of God. It's like God activates God's self and becomes the universe. And that's what the universe is. It's just the continual unfolding of God in and as space and time. So what this means is that the universe itself is the incarnation of God. And everything in the universe is a part of that ecstatic incarnation of God. So, sure, Jesus was divine for Bruno, but in that sense, sort of everything is, right? He didn't need the incarnation of God in the person of Jesus of Nazareth because he already had the incarnation of God in the physical universe, in and as the physical universe. So, to try to get himself out of trouble, he would sort of throw some Christ bits into his cosmology here and there, but it was half-hearted and everybody knew it was half-hearted.
Some Christ bits.
Yeah, just a little Christ bits.
Sprinkle a little of this.
I think this is probably an unpopular reading, but I think Nicholas of Cusa had done the same thing a century and a half earlier.
Right.
And sort of tagged a Christ section onto his De Docta Ignorantia. I don't think he needed Christ at all, but I think he had to put him somewhere in there. So we get this third chapter that's suddenly about Christ, and you're like, what the hell? Why is this here? But Nicholas did it more convincingly. And also without being a brat. It seems like Giordano Bruno was a real brat. What I find fascinating about Bruno is not just that he anticipated all of these modern scientific intuitions, things like the infinity of the universe, which he did, infinite number of solar systems within the universe, which he did. That's cool. But what I find more, at least theoretically productive, is this notion of the universe itself as a kind of unfolded incarnation of divinity.
So from what I know about cosmic Christology, like especially in the East and with like Maximus the Confessor and Bonaventure, and it seems like there could be some kind of hospitality even within the Christian symbol set to something like a Trinitarian pantheism or at least panentheism or something like that. But yeah, thinking about the Christ as something that exceeds or is in excess of Jesus of Nazareth is interesting to me.
Yeah, and I think that there are resources throughout the tradition for thinking this way, and it's part of the reason that pantheism is such a problem for Christianity is that. Right, like pantheism is not a problem for Hindu cosmology, for example. Part of the reason it's such a problem for Christian cosmology is that it's such a temptation for Christian cosmology. Right, the minute you see you've got the structure, the Christic structure, one is tempted to see it everywhere. This was Kierkegaard's big. Bugaboo was that poorly trained theologians were seeing Christ everywhere when we were really just meant to see Christ in one particular thing, because otherwise you lose the paradox, right? You lose the paradox.
Right.
Christ is everywhere. I think that it's in part this is that same structure of the sort of repellent seduction. It's that I'm not saying that pantheism is a Christian projection, but Christianity gives rise to a certain flavor of pantheism that it then hates.
That's really interesting, huh?
Fears, yeah.
One could even pick up where Altizer leaves off with the death of God and kind of the continual downward movement of spirit into flesh, and say, oh, that could turn out something like pantheism on the other end of it or whatever. But in terms of pantheism, Spinoza is the guy I think most often associated with that term. And we actually did a reading group earlier in the year looking at the ethics. And then not too long ago, a friend of mine did a reading group on 1,000 Plateaus. During that, a friend of mine, Simon, he made a reference to the Hermetic roots that can be found in Deleuze. And I don't know, I thought that was interesting, but it didn't really get much further than that at the time. And then I knew that I'd be speaking to you. And I also know Bruno is important for your work. And so I better know something about him. So I started poking around a little bit and discovered pretty quickly that besides being a philosopher, he was, pretty clearly, as far as I can tell, a magician, right? Steeped in this Hermetic tradition. And that's set me off in a very kind of odd direction. But I was listening to his, there's an audiobook of one of his texts on magic. This was literally just last week. So I haven't really had time to get too into it, but I was struck by how similar it sounds to Spinoza's ethics at times. And I know that this connection is already there, right? Others have made it. Do you have any thoughts or reflections about Bruno the magician, or to what extent the ethics might be read as a kind of, I don't know, like a translation of a certain cosmology and metaphysics, but also a translation of magical concepts into secular terms?
Wow. Okay. Let me get at some of that, because the Hermetic Bruno is he's just repressed then by everybody who comes along after Bruno and tries to make some sense of it, or call him a saint or a hero, right? That you don't get the Hermetic Bruno in Neil deGrasse Tyson's Cosmos, which otherwise calls him a a saint of modern science.
Right.
Yeah, there's that Hermetic Deleuze book, but who is it? Is it Josh Ramey who writes the Hermetic Deleuze book?
Somebody just sent me a PDF of it. I don't remember who wrote it. Wait, I can find it.
Yeah, it's Josh Ramey.
Okay.
And I think that it's really Deleuze who sort of picks through Deleuze's own version of Spinoza, who is, frankly, a lot more interesting than actually reading Spinoza, to find
exactly.
to find these kind of magical or mystical resonances. I think so. Okay, so the kind of magical overtones in Bruno. Here's the thing: if for Bruno, the created world is the creating world. If it is the unmitigated outpouring of divinity itself, then everything that is not inert dead matter, but it is live, active materiality. And in that sense, everything that is an agent. Everything that is does stuff. So he says, this is Bruno says, everything is sentient. Everything is alive. Everything
has the power to act.
Has the power to act, get stuff done. And he's got this one really cranky Oxford Aristotelian who says, "Oh, does that mean that my slippers and my robe are all alive?" And the character who's speaking to him says, well, no, not as slippers and as robe, they're not alive. But the substance that gives rise to them, qua slippers and robe, is itself alive, right? That substance shows up as different things and gets things done. So in that sense, okay, yes, your slippers and your robe are made of something that is itself alive. Therefore, in that sense, they're alive. So there's this animism coursing through Bruno that I think gets deadened almost to the point of unrecognizability in Spinoza. What Spinoza picks up on, of course, is the singularity of substance that he deploys against a particularly weak moment in Descartes' argument, to assert the unity of mind and body, the unity of extended and thinking substance. But we don't get in Spinoza that sort of revelry about the consequent animation of all things. We can deduce it from Spinoza. It's preserved in Spinoza, but I don't think that it's, and again, this is my reading, so I'm perfectly willing to have my mind changed on this, but I don't find in Spinoza all that much celebration, say, of the animacy of the natural world. I find it certainly in Deleuze's retrieval of Spinoza, certainly in Bruno's prefiguring of Spinoza, and absolutely in the romantic reappropriations of Spinoza, in in Schlegel and Schleiermacher and the Schlues, all the Schlu guys excited about Spinoza. It's in Goethe, right? And they perform these sort of deliberate misreadings of Spinoza in order to get a kind of nature lover out of him, as does Thoreau, as does Emerson, as does Melville, right? But these are all, I think, perhaps more, they push Spinoza in directions that I fear Spinoza didn't want to go, because Spinoza had such an anchoring in the classical world. Yeah. That there's something about Spinoza that sort of strains against himself, and I think that tumbles into Hermeticism, say in the earlier Bruno, and certainly in the Romantics later on.
It's interesting to me. I don't know a lot about the Hermetic tradition in any sort of scholarly sense, but it does seem to me that the more that we seek to pay attention to Hermeticism as a sort of almost kind of parallel tradition that interweaves in and around Neoplatonism to an extent, but is sort of its own conversation. I think the more that we see Christian theologies and other theologies as well, the debt to Hermeticism that I think we ignore to our own peril. And I also think that it's very interesting now, especially like in sort of a lot of scientific conversations about panpsychism or pan-proto-psychism, or however you want to kind of hash it out, that there's this new sort of opening or opportunity to reread the Hermetic in this really interesting and productive way. So.
Yeah, I think that's true, and I think it's also the case that the particularly animist strain of Hermeticism that comes across in Bruno and that comes across in some of the Romantics might be a more interesting way of talking about the interrelation of things than panpsychism. I worry a bit about the glorification of consciousness as the pinnacle of all creation, and there's what I think is a seductive but deceptive seeming move away from anthropocentrism in the ascription of consciousness to all things. But what this really does, I think, is to say, oh, right, all things are like us, or all things have this awesome thing. But I'm not no great fan of consciousness. It doesn't seem to do much. Right, photosynthesis is much more interesting than consciousness.
Yeah. So I hear your critique as a sort of like, it's a crypto anthropocentrism. I'm wondering if you could hash out a little more what your position or what direction you'd want to sort of move, because that's very fascinating to me, I guess.
Right. So one of the theologies that we find uncannily resurrecting itself, in addition to the Father God, is the great chain of being that organizes all creatures from on a hierarchical scale, from God through the angels, through man, through woman, through through mammals, and all the way down to trees and then rocks. Right, rocks are usually the lowest on this order of things. And even again, this is another one of those examples of the scientific tradition rehabilitating steady theological concepts, even when it proclaims itself to be entirely free of theology. It seems to me that most conversations concerning emergence theory that either resolve themselves into a sort of paradigm of reductionism, or a strong emergence, or weak emergence, or strong panpsychism, or weak panpsychism, still operate with this utterly unquestioned assumption that the most complex creatures on the planet are humans, and that mind is the pinnacle of creation, and that human mind is the phenomenon toward which all of universal history has been tending. So it is our obligation to figure out how we get from, amoebas, but ultimately it would be really nice to figure out how to get from like quarks to brains. Which is, again, that same, we've just ditched the angels and God, but it's the same. And so the two options then between reductionism and panpsychism are either everything is reducible to a blind concourse of inanimate particles on the one hand, or everything is reducible to little bits of consciousness or proto-consciousness on the other hand. And I'd love to be able to ask if there's a different way to account for the emergence of not just complexity, but of difference, of different things, right? How do we get different stuff from these same components? And so then rather than taking our own, what we think of our own mental cognitive processes and projecting them back upon bacterial flagella, or even quarks and protons and neutrons, to ask instead about, and this is, I think, where this is a question that Matt was asking at the beginning, where new materialism comes in. I think that some of the new materialist authors are really helpful in their efforts to think animacy and agency without necessarily ascribing to all agency, a specifically human consciousness, right? We can say that bacteria do and produce and create and want things, and try to resist, therefore, ascribing to them mind, right? Or what we call mind or human mind.
Yeah.
We could ask instead how it is that what we think of as mind is the process of bacterial processes, which isn't to say that it's, that they're the random concourse of inanimate things, right? We might just say that agency is something other than what we thought it was. I would like to find some kind of way, and there have to be lots of different ways, to dislodge human consciousness as the pinnacle of creation and as the locus of all agency that matters. And I think that part of the byproduct of thinking that way is, again, this disembodied God in the sky who is just consciousness, right? Who's just kind of masculine consciousness.
You've converted me.
I get really cranky about it. I'm sorry. I don't mean to sound so cranky.
No, it's all good.
So where do you imagine yourself going next in your work? Do you have any idea at this point? Like, what are you thinking ahead toward?
So the project I'm currently working on it's actually I can probably say this. It's a co-authored book with Mark Taylor and Tom Carlson on image and imagination, and I'm working. I won't talk about their work because it's their work, but I'm looking at the images of the Earth from space, photos that are generated from particularly the Apollo missions, and on the one hand, and then images of the entire universe or the cosmic microwave background on the other. And I'm trying to figure out what the impulse to visualize the whole, whether it's the whole Earth or the whole world or the whole universe, where that impulse comes from, what kind of ethical imperatives it engenders, or unethical imperatives it engenders. So images of the Earth and images of the universe is the next one for me. And I'm thinking I might want after that to give some attention to the effort to colonize Mars. So that may be where I'm going.
That's awesome.
Yeah. Well, thanks for talking with us again. That was a lot of fun. Is there anything else that you want to mention while we're doing this?
Well, if there's any chance that you have in your maybe introductory words to give a heads up to the Pantheism book, which is coming out in September, that would be great.
Absolutely.
Pantheology is God's World's Monsters.
Okay, will do.
Great. Thank you so
Awesome.
much.
This was great. And I'll send you a note when we're going to publish.
That's perfect. That would be wonderful.
Awesome.
So nice to meet both of you.
Yeah, it was really good to meet you virtually. Maybe we'll bump into each other.
Excellent. Will you be in Denver? Or?
I'm not sure.